On the morning of December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time. By nighthat evening, 280 million people went to sleep as citizens of a nation that no longer existed. Their pensions, denominated in Soviet rubles, became worthless overnight. Their savings accounts frozen. The government bonds worth less than the paper they were printed on. 70 years of accumulated wealth, gone in a single political transition. But here's what the history books rarely mention. Not everyone lost everything. A small percentage of Soviet citizens, those who understood what was coming, had quietly moved their wealth into assets the state couldn't erase. Gold coins hidden in floorboards. Farmland deeded to relatives. Skills that translated across any border. Foreign currency tucked away in places the government couldn't reach. While their neighbors lined up for bread with wheelbarrows full of worthless rubles, these families emerged on the other side of the collapse with their purchasing power intact. Some emerged wealthier than before. This was not luck. This was pattern recognition, because the Soviet Union was not unique. The same wealth destruction had played out in Rome, in Spain, in Weimar Germany, in Argentina, in Zimbabwe. The same assets that survived those collapses survived the Soviet one, and those same assets will survive the next one. The question is not whether another collapse will happen. History guarantees it will. The question is, when it does, what will you be holding? In the year 241 AD, a Roman soldier named Marcus received his monthly pay in silver denarii, coins that had held their value for generations. His grandfather had been paid in the same currency. His great-grandfather too. The denarius was Rome. Rome was the denarius. It had been that way for nearly 3 centuries. Marcus didn't know it, but he was holding a dying currency. When the denarius was first minted under Emperor Augustus, it contained 95% pure silver. By the time Marcus received his wages, that same coin contained barely 40% silver. The rest was copper and base metals. The emperors had been quietly diluting the currency for decades, shaving a little silver here, adding a little copper there. Most Romans never noticed. The coins still looked the same, they still spent the same, but prices had begun to creep upward. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius in his grandfather's time now cost 3. Marcus blamed greedy merchants. He blamed bad harvests. He blamed barbarians at the border. He never blamed the coin in his hand. This is how every collapse begins, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a sudden event, but with a slow, invisible erosion that most people don't recognize until it's far too late. By 268 AD, just 27 years after Marcus received his pay, the denarius contained only 0.5% silver. Prices had increased by over 1,000%. The Roman economy was in free fall. Soldiers demanded payment in gold or goods. Farmers refused to sell crops for worthless coins. The great Roman trade networks, the arteries of the empire, began to collapse. The Roman Empire would limp on for another 2 centuries in the West. But the economic damage was done. A currency that had stood for 300 years had been destroyed in a single generation. And here is the pattern that repeats across every empire, every nation, every civilization that has ever risen and fallen. The destruction follows a predictable sequence. Phase 1. Denial. The early warning signs appear, but they're dismissed. Prices rise, but experts explain it away. Debt accumulates, but it's called investment in the future. The currency weakens, but officials insist it's temporary. During this phase, the majority of the population notices nothing wrong. They go about their lives, trusting that the system that has always worked will continue to work. In Weimar Germany, this phase lasted from 1919 to mid-1921. The German mark had lost value after World War I, but most Germans believed the economy would stabilize. Savings accounts still paid interest. Banks still operated. The shops still had goods on the shelves. Yes, prices were higher than before the war, but Germany had lost a war. Things would normalize. They didn't. Phase 2. Panic. The erosion accelerates beyond the point of control. What took years now takes months. What took months now takes weeks. The population suddenly realizes something is deeply wrong, but by now the options for protection have narrowed dramatically. In Germany, phase 2 began in the summer of 1922. The mark, which had traded at 160 to the US dollar in January, plummeted to 8,000 by December. Prices changed not monthly, not weekly, but daily. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, so they could rush out and spend their wages before they lost more value. Restaurants stopped printing menus because prices changed between the time customers sat down and the time they ordered. A middle-class German family who had spent 30 years accumulating savings, enough to retire comfortably, watched that wealth evaporate in 18 months. A lifetime of discipline and thrift destroyed. Phase 3, confiscation. When a government faces economic collapse, it does not go quietly. It reaches for whatever wealth remains accessible. Bank accounts are frozen. Capital controls are imposed. Assets are seized temporarily for the national good. The rules that everyone believed would protect them are suspended or rewritten overnight. On December 1st, 2001, the government of Argentina implemented what became known as the Corralito, the Little Corral. Without warning, all bank accounts in the country were frozen. Citizens were prohibited from withdrawing more than 250 pesos per week from their own savings. Money that people had worked decades to accumulate was suddenly inaccessible. The middle class, those who had trusted the banking system, who had done everything right, were trapped. They stood outside banks, banging on doors, demanding access to their own money. Riots erupted. The president fled the capital in a helicopter. Those with money in foreign accounts or with physical assets outside the banking system watched from safety. Their wealth was untouched. The confiscation couldn't reach them. Phase 4, reset. Eventually the old system dies completely, and something new emerges. Old currencies are replaced. Old debts are restructured or erased. Old fortunes are wiped out, and new ones are created. This is the moment when the wealth transfer is complete, from those who held paper to those who held real assets. In Zimbabwe, the reset came in 2009. After years of hyperinflation that had produced the infamous $100 trillion note, a bill that couldn't buy a bus ticket, the government finally abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar entirely. It ceased to exist. Citizens were allowed to exchange their worthless currency for US dollars at a rate of 35 quadrillion Zimbabwean dollars to $1 US. If you had held your entire net worth in Zimbabwean dollars, you were ruined. If you had held physical gold, foreign currency, or productive land, you emerged intact. This four-phase sequence, denial, panic, confiscation, reset, has repeated with remarkable consistency across centuries and continents. The specific circumstances change. The currencies have different names. The governments issue different excuses. But the pattern remains identical. And within this pattern, there is a hierarchy of asset destruction. Paper assets die first. Stocks are the earliest casualties. They begin declining while most people still believe in the system. Bonds follow as interest rates spike and governments struggle to service their debts. Then the currency itself collapses, taking with it everything denominated in that currency. Savings accounts, pensions, insurance policies, fixed income investments, bank deposits, which most people consider safe, are among the last paper assets to fall. But fall they do, either through inflation that erodes their purchasing power, or through direct confiscation, or through bank failures that exceed the limits of deposit insurance. Only after paper assets have been destroyed does the destruction reach physical assets. Real estate may be seized or taxed into oblivion, but the land itself doesn't disappear. Gold may be confiscated, but it retains its value in the hands of whoever holds it. Productive skills may become worthless in one jurisdiction, but they can be transported across borders. There is a reason the average fiat currency in human history has survived only 27 years. There is a reason 20% of all currencies that have ever existed were destroyed by hyperinflation. There is a reason that of the 750 currencies that have existed since 1700, fewer than 20% still exist today. The pattern doesn't break. It only changes addresses. The Romans didn't believe it would happen to them. Neither did the Germans. Neither did the Argentines. Neither did the Zimbabweans. And here is what history teaches us. The point of no return typically occurs when government debt exceeds 130% of GDP. At that level, the math becomes impossible. The debt cannot be repaid through growth. It cannot be repaid through taxation. It can only be repaid through one mechanism, the destruction of the currency. The United States crossed 130% in 2020. But before we examine where America stands today, we need to understand the first asset that has survived every collapse in recorded history, the one that was money before money existed. On August 1st, 1946, a Hungarian clerk named István walked into a Budapest market with his monthly salary. He had been paid that morning 500 trillion pengo, the Hungarian currency. Written out in full, that number contained 15 zeros. It wasn't enough to buy a kilogram of bread. Hungary in 1946 holds a record that has never been broken, the worst hyperinflation in human history. Prices doubled every 15 hours. The government printed banknotes so large, 100 quintillion pengo, that the numbers became meaningless. Workers were paid 3 times a day and sprinted to the markets during their breaks, knowing that lunch would cost more than breakfast. But in that same Budapest, in that same summer of 1946, there existed a parallel economy. Small gold coins, some dating back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, changed hands in quiet transactions. A single gold ducat, weighing just 3.5 grams, could purchase what trillions of pengo could not. Food for a family for a month. The paper had failed. The gold had not. This is not a Hungarian anomaly. It is a pattern that stretches back to the earliest recorded civilizations. When the French revolutionary government issued the assignat in 1789, it was backed by the full faith and credit of the new republic and the seized lands of the Catholic Church. For a brief moment, the assignat traded at par with gold. The revolutionaries declared it the currency of liberty, of progress, of the future. Within 6 years, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. By 1796, the government abandoned it entirely. Those who had converted their gold to assignats, trusting in the new order, were devastated. Those who had hidden their louis d'or coins waited out the chaos. When stability returned, they emerged with their purchasing power intact, while their neighbors had nothing. Why does gold survive when everything else fails? The answer lies in 3 properties that no government can legislate away. First, scarcity. All the gold ever mined in human history. Every ounce extracted from every mine on every continent since the pharaohs would fit into a cube measuring just 22 meters on each side. That's roughly the size of a tennis court stacked 3 stories high. This isn't theory, it's geometry. No government can print gold. No central bank can create it from nothing. The supply increases by roughly 1.5% per year, the rate at which it can be physically extracted from the earth. Compare that to currencies, which can be expanded by 20%, 50%, or 1,000% with a few keystrokes. Second, indestructibility. Gold does not rust. It does not corrode. It does not decay. Coins pulled from Roman shipwrecks after 2,000 years beneath the sea retain their weight and purity. A gold bar buried in a garden in 1923 can be dug up in 2023 and sold for full value. No paper asset can make this claim. Third, universal recognition. Gold requires no government guarantee, no banking system, no electrical grid. It is money that works when nothing else works. A gold coin is accepted in Mumbai, Montana, and Munich. It was accepted in those same places 500 years ago. It will be accepted 500 years from now. This is why, on the morning of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon faced a decision that would reshape the global financial system. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had been exchanging their US dollars for American gold, as was their right under the Bretton Woods Agreement. The problem was simple. America had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. The French knew it, the British knew it, everyone knew it, and they were coming for the gold. Nixon closed the gold window. From that day forward, the dollar would be backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government. The same backing that had supported the assignat, the same backing that had supported the pengo. In 1971, gold traded at $35 per ounce, the fixed rate that had existed since 1934. By 1980, it reached $850. Those who understood what Nixon's announcement truly meant, the severing of the last connection between paper money and physical reality, multiplied their wealth by more than 20 times in 9 years. But gold carries risks that must be understood. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for American citizens to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates. Citizens were required to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve at a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. Refusal meant a fine of $10,000 and up to 10 years in prison. Most Americans complied, their gold was gone. 1 year later, the government revalued gold to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase. Those who had surrendered their gold at $20.67 had been legally robbed of the difference. Those who had hidden their gold or moved it offshore before the order captured that gain. This is why, in 2013, the German government began a quiet operation to repatriate 674 tons of gold from vaults in New York and Paris. The official explanation was trust building with the German public. But observers noted the timing. 5 years after the 2008 financial crisis, with central banks around the world printing money at unprecedented rates, Germany wanted its gold where it could touch it. The operation took until 2017 to complete. Germany now holds over 50% of its gold reserves on its own soil. They remember what happened to gold in 1933. They remember what happened to currencies in 1923. They are not taking chances. Today, the nation with the largest private gold holdings is not the United States, not Germany, not Switzerland. It is India. Indian households hold an estimated 25,000 tons of gold, worth approximately $1.5 trillion at current prices. This is more than the official reserves of the United States, Germany, and France combined. This is not jewelry for decoration. This is generational wealth preservation, embedded into the culture over thousands of years. Indian families understood, long before modern economists, that paper promises fail. Gold does not. For those seeking to protect wealth through the next collapse, gold offers 3 principles that history has validated repeatedly. Physical possession only. Paper gold, ETFs, futures contracts, unallocated accounts is still paper. When the system fails, paper claims on gold will be worth exactly what paper claims on everything else are worth. Nothing. Geographic diversification. Never store all precious metals in one country. Confiscation happened in America in 1933. It can happen again. Vaults in Switzerland, Singapore, and other stable jurisdictions offer protection that domestic storage cannot. Generational thinking. Gold is not a short-term trade, it is a multi-generational store of value. The same gold coin that protected a family through the French Revolution can protect their descendants today. But gold has a limitation. You cannot eat it. You cannot live in it. You cannot grow crops from it. Which brings us to the second asset that has survived every collapse. One that produces value simply by existing. On a September morning in 1945, a Japanese landowner named Takeshi Yamamoto stood in his rice fields outside Osaka and watched American bombers fly overhead. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The empire his family had served for generations lay in ruins. Yamamoto had lost almost everything. His investments in Japanese war bonds, worthless. His savings in the Bank of Japan, frozen and soon to be destroyed by inflation. His family's import business, obliterated along with the ports that had sustained it. But beneath his feet, the soil remained. Within 5 years, that same soil would make him wealthy again. As Japan rebuilt, as 80 million people needed to eat, as the economy clawed back from total devastation, Yamamoto's land produced rice. Rice that hungry people would pay for in whatever currency existed. Rice that could be stored, traded, consumed. Rice that the government could not print, could not debase, could not legislate out of existence. His paper wealth had been destroyed. His productive land endured. This pattern, land surviving what paper cannot, extends back centuries before Yamamoto and continues decades after him. But it comes with a critical distinction that separates those who preserve wealth from those who lose everything. Not all land is equal. The land that survives collapse is land that produces. In 1845, Ireland was one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. Over 8 million people lived on an island dominated by tenant farmers who worked land they did not own. The landlords, many of them English aristocrats who had never set foot on their Irish holdings, collected rents from a distance. Then the potato blight arrived. Between 1845 and 1852, 1 million Irish died of starvation and disease. Another million fled. The tenant farmers, those who worked the land but held no title to it, were devastated. When they couldn't pay rent, they were evicted. When they were evicted, they starved. But the landlords, despite the catastrophe unfolding on their properties, largely retained their wealth. Many continued collecting whatever rents could be extracted. When the famine ended, they still owned the land. Some sold their holdings at depressed prices. Others waited for values to recover. The land itself, regardless of who farmed it, regardless of who died upon it, remained. This is the brutal mathematics of productive land. It generates value independent of the economic system surrounding it. A field that grows wheat under a monarchy will grow wheat under a republic. Pasture that feeds cattle under capitalism will feed cattle under socialism. The political system may change. The currency may collapse. The government may fall. The land produces. However, and this is where the pattern reveals its complexity, land can be taken. On October 26, 1917, the Bolsheviks issued the decree on land. All private ownership of land in Russia was abolished. Estates that had been held by aristocratic families for centuries were seized overnight. The great landowners of Imperial Russia, families whose holdings stretched across thousands of hectares, were dispossessed, exiled, or executed. The land didn't disappear, but its owners did. The same pattern repeated in China after 1949, when Mao's land reform transferred an estimated 47 million hectares from landlords to peasants, often through violent struggle sessions that left millions of former landowners dead. It repeated in Cuba after 1959, when Castro's government nationalized all agricultural holdings above a certain size. It repeated in Zimbabwe beginning in 2000, when Robert Mugabe's fast-track land reform expelled white farmers and redistributed their land to political allies. So here is the critical question. If land can be confiscated, how can it be considered a collapse-resistant asset? The answer lies in understanding which collapses lead to confiscation and which do not. Land seizures occur almost exclusively during revolutionary political transitions, moments when an entirely new system of government takes power and seeks to redistribute wealth as a matter of ideology. The Russian Revolution, the Chinese Communist victory, the Cuban Revolution. These were not merely economic crises, they were total political transformations. Currency collapses, by contrast, rarely lead to land confiscation. In Weimar Germany, hyperinflation destroyed paper wealth but left land ownership largely intact. In Argentina during the 2001 crisis, the peso collapsed but property rights were maintained. In Zimbabwe itself, the currency was destroyed multiple times, but land seizures were driven by political ideology, not economic necessity. The historical pattern suggests a framework. Land is vulnerable to revolutionary confiscation, but resistant to monetary collapse. This means jurisdiction matters enormously. Land in a country with a 500-year history of stable property rights, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, carries different risks than land in a country with recent revolutionary history. The Dutch have maintained continuous records of land ownership since the 1600s. Farmland in the Netherlands has survived the 80 Years' War, the Napoleonic occupation, 2 world wars, and multiple currency changes. It has never been systematically confiscated. This stability is reflected in prices. Dutch agricultural land has appreciated in real terms over 4 centuries, one of the longest continuous records of any asset class. Not because the Dutch are uniquely virtuous, but because property rights, once established and defended for generations become self-reinforcing. The system protects itself. For those seeking to hold land as a collapse-resistant asset, 4 criteria separate protected holdings from vulnerable ones. Productive capacity. The land must generate value through its use. Agriculture, timber, livestock, mineral extraction. Speculative land held purely for appreciation carries the same risks as any other speculative asset. Productive land generates income regardless of what happens to financial markets. Water access. In an era of increasing scarcity, land without reliable water is land without value. The most collapse-resistant holdings include deeded water rights, natural springs, frontage on rivers or lakes, or access to proven aquifers. Water transforms land from an asset into a self-sustaining system. Jurisdictional stability. The land should be located in a country with a long history of respecting property rights, an independent judiciary, and rule of law. This does not guarantee safety. Nothing does, but it dramatically improves the odds. Physical accessibility. During a collapse, absentee ownership becomes problematic. Land you cannot reach, cannot defend, and cannot personally oversee becomes vulnerable in ways that nearby land does not. The aristocratic families who maintained wealth across centuries understood these principles intuitively. They didn't buy land as a speculation. They bought productive estates that would generate income for their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, regardless of which king sat on the throne or which currency filled the treasury. Today, this pattern continues. Institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, family offices have steadily increased their allocations to agricultural land. They are not seeking short-term returns. They are seeking the same thing Takeshi Yamamoto found in his rice fields in 1945, an asset that produces value when everything else has failed. But even the best land is tied to a single location. What happens when you need to move your wealth across borders? Quickly, quietly, and completely. In the winter of 1923, a German factory owner named Heinrich Braun made a decision that would determine his family's fate for generations. While his neighbors converted their marks to tangible goods, pianos, furniture, anything that might hold value, Braun did something different. Each week, he took a portion of his factory's earnings and quietly exchanged them for Swiss francs. The transaction was legal, but unusual. Why would anyone want foreign currency when German marks were still accepted everywhere? By November 1923, Braun had his answer. The German mark, which had traded at 4.2 to the US dollar before World War I, now required 4.2 trillion to buy that same dollar. A wheelbarrow full of marks couldn't purchase a newspaper. The lifetime savings of the German middle class had been annihilated, but Braun's Swiss francs, tucked away in a Zurich account, retained their purchasing power. When the dust settled, when the new Rentenmark replaced the worthless papier mark, Braun converted his Swiss holdings back into German currency. He bought distressed properties at a fraction of their former value. He acquired equipment from bankrupt competitors. He emerged from the hyperinflation wealthier than he had entered it. His neighbors, who had mocked his paranoia, never recovered. This is the power of holding stable foreign currency during a domestic collapse. It creates an exit when all other exits have closed. The mechanism is straightforward. When a currency collapses, it collapses relative to something. That something is typically stronger currencies, those backed by more disciplined monetary policy, more stable governments, more productive economies. By holding the stronger currency before the collapse accelerates, you preserve purchasing power that can be deployed when the crisis reaches its nadir. Argentina has provided a modern laboratory for this principle. In December 2001, when the Argentine government froze bank accounts and prohibited peso withdrawals, citizens discovered a brutal truth. Their money in Argentine banks was no longer their money. The peso, which had been pegged to the US dollar at a 1.1 ratio for a decade, was devalued by 75% within weeks. But Argentines who had maintained dollar accounts outside the country, in Miami, in Montevideo, in the Cayman Islands, watched from safety. Their dollars remained dollars. When the peso stabilized at roughly 3 to the dollar, they could convert back and triple their purchasing power. This was not theoretical. It was observed, documented, and repeated by those who understood the pattern. Venezuela has extended this lesson into the 21st century. As the Bolivar collapsed, losing 99.99% of its value between 2012 and 2021, an underground dollar economy emerged. Salaries were quoted in dollars. Real estate transactions settled in dollars. Street vendors calculated prices in dollars and converted to bolivars only at the moment of payment. Those who managed to accumulate dollars, despite government restrictions, maintained their living standards. Those who relied solely on bolivars watched their monthly salary shrink to the equivalent of a few dollars. The same job, the same hours, the same effort, separated by the single variable of which currency you held. But here is where the pattern reveals a critical warning. In Lebanon, starting in 2019, citizens discovered that even dollar accounts weren't safe if they were held in the wrong place. The Lebanese pound lost over 95% of its value. Lebanese citizens who had dollar accounts at Lebanese banks assumed they were protected. They were wrong. The banks imposed arbitrary withdrawal limits. Dollars deposited could only be withdrawn as pounds at artificial exchange rates that represented a fraction of the true value. A depositor with $100,000 in a Lebanese dollar account might only access $5,000 of actual purchasing power. The lesson was clear. The location of the currency matters as much as the currency itself. A dollar in a Lebanese bank was not the same as a dollar in a Swiss bank. A Swiss franc held in a Venezuelan institution was not the same as a Swiss franc held in Geneva. This brings us to the hierarchy of currency safety during collapse. At the bottom sits the collapsing local currency, held only in the minimum amounts needed for daily transactions. Above that sits foreign currency, held within the domestic banking system, better than local currency, but still vulnerable to capital controls and banking failures. Higher still sits foreign currency held in foreign banks in stable jurisdictions, accessible but requiring international banking relationships. At the apex sits physical foreign currency, cash that requires no banking system, no electronic transfer, no permission from any authority. Each tier represents a trade-off between convenience and security. The most secure position, physical foreign currency diversified across multiple stable denominations, is also the least convenient. It pays no interest. It can be stolen. It requires physical storage. But when the banking system freezes, it is the only currency that remains accessible. This is why certain currencies have historically served as refugees during crisis. The Swiss franc maintained its value through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the collapse of Bretton Woods, and the 2008 financial crisis. Switzerland's political neutrality, disciplined monetary policy, and tradition of banking secrecy created a currency that others trust precisely when trust becomes scarce. During World War II, as Europe burned, Swiss francs remained convertible and stable, an island of monetary sanity in a sea of chaos. The Singapore dollar offers similar characteristics in the Asian context. Since independence in 1965, Singapore has maintained strict monetary discipline, accumulated massive foreign reserves relative to its size, and built a reputation for institutional stability. The Singapore dollar has strengthened against virtually every major currency over the past half-century. Some nations have taken the ultimate step, abandoning their domestic currency entirely. Ecuador dollarized in 2000 after its own currency collapse, adopting the US dollar as legal tender. Zimbabwe, after destroying its currency multiple times, now operates primarily on US dollars and South African rand. These nations acknowledged what their citizens already knew. Their governments could not be trusted with monetary authority. For individuals seeking currency protection, the strategy involves 3 tiers maintained simultaneously. Tier 1, hard assets that transcend all currencies. Gold, productive land, essential commodities. These anchor the portfolio against all monetary failure. Tier 2, stable foreign currencies held outside the domestic banking system. Swiss francs, Singapore dollars, physical US dollars, accessible when domestic banks freeze. Tier 3, domestic currency in minimum operational amounts, enough for daily transactions, not enough to represent meaningful wealth. The proportions shift based on perceived risk. In stable times, Tier 3 might dominate. As warning signs accumulate, wealth migrates upward through the tiers. But even the best currency strategy has a limitation. Currencies can be carried, but they cannot work. They cannot adapt. They cannot rebuild. The next asset has none of these limitations. It crosses every border, survives every confiscation, and appreciates with use rather than depreciating with age. On August 4th, 1972, the president of Uganda, Idi Amin, stood before television cameras and issued a decree that would displace 80,000 people in 90 days. All Asians, primarily Indians and Pakistanis, whose families had lived in Uganda for generations, were ordered to leave. They could take only what they could carry. Their businesses were confiscated, their bank accounts were frozen, their properties were handed to Amin's political allies. The expelled arrived in Britain, Canada, and other Commonwealth nations with virtually nothing. Families who had owned department stores, factories, and trading companies stepped off airplanes with a single suitcase. What happened next defied every expectation. Within a decade, the Ugandan Asian community in Britain had become one of the most economically successful immigrant groups in the country. Former shopkeepers built retail empires. Former factory managers started manufacturing companies. Former traders established import-export networks that spanned continents. By the 1990s, the Ugandan Asian diaspora in Britain had a higher average income than the native British population. They had lost everything tangible. But they had retained something that Amin could not confiscate: skills, knowledge, relationships, and the commercial instincts developed over generations of business ownership. This is the fourth asset that survives collapse, and in many ways it is the most powerful. Gold can be confiscated, land can be seized, currency can be frozen, but skills travel inside the person who possesses them. They cross borders invisibly. They cannot be declared at customs. They cannot be taxed at the point of departure. They regenerate wealth wherever they land. The 20th century produced multiple natural experiments that demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917, the aristocracy faced extermination or exile. Those who escaped, the white Russian émigrés, arrived in Paris, Berlin, and Shanghai with their titles but without their estates. The adjustment was catastrophic for many. Princes became taxi drivers, countesses worked as seamstresses. But within this displaced population, a pattern emerged. Those who had possessed only status, whose identity was entirely bound to their position in the Russian hierarchy, never recovered. They lived out their days in genteel poverty, sustained by memories of a world that no longer existed. Those who had possessed skills fared differently. Russian engineers found work in French industry. Russian musicians joined orchestras across Europe. Russian doctors rebuilt practices in new languages. Their aristocratic titles became historical curiosities. Their abilities became their new wealth. The same pattern repeated with German Jews in the 1930s. As Nazi persecution intensified, Jews who could emigrate faced the choice of what to abandon. Most material wealth could not be extracted. Bank accounts were frozen. Businesses were Aryanized. Art collections were seized. The emigrants arrived in America, Britain, and Palestine with a fraction of their former net worth. But what arrived with them transformed their destinations. Albert Einstein brought physics. Billy Wilder brought filmmaking. Henry Kissinger, who arrived as a 15-year-old refugee, brought intellectual capabilities that would eventually shape American foreign policy. Thousands of Jewish doctors, lawyers, scientists, and engineers brought expertise that enriched their adopted nations. The pattern was so pronounced that economists later attempted to quantify it. Studies of German Jewish refugees found that within one generation, their descendants had achieved educational and income levels that exceeded the national average of their host countries. The wealth they had lost in Germany had been rebuilt and often surpassed through the compound interest of transferred skills. Cuba, after 1959, provided another demonstration. When Castro's revolution nationalized private enterprise, the Cuban professional and business class faced a choice: adapt to the new system or leave. Between 1959 and 1980, approximately 800,000 Cubans emigrated, primarily to South Florida. They arrived as refugees. They built what became known as the Cuban Miracle in Miami. Former Cuban bankers established financial institutions. Former Cuban manufacturers started factories. Former Cuban retailers built shopping centers. Within 2 decades, Cuban Americans had transformed Miami from a regional tourist destination into a major international business hub. Today, the Cuban American community has produced senators, CEOs, and billionaires. They did not accomplish this because they arrived with capital. Most arrived with almost nothing. They accomplished it because they arrived with capabilities, with knowledge of how to run businesses, manage people, navigate markets, and create value. Those capabilities, applied in a new environment, with stable property rights, regenerated the wealth that Castro had confiscated. The Iranian diaspora, after 1979, followed the same trajectory. The Vietnamese boat people of 1975 followed the same trajectory. In each case, refugees stripped of material wealth rebuilt within a generation, if they possess transferable skills. This raises a critical question: which skills transfer and which do not? The evidence points to several categories that consistently survive displacement. Medical skills translate across almost any border. A surgeon trained in Tehran can, after appropriate certification, practice in Toronto. The knowledge of human anatomy, the manual dexterity developed over years of practice, the diagnostic capabilities. These exist independent of any political system. Engineering and technical skills demonstrate similar portability. The mathematics underlying structural engineering works identically in Havana and Houston. Software code compiles the same way in Saigon and San Jose. Skilled trades, electricians, plumbers, mechanics, machinists possess expertise that every society requires. These skills may require licensing in new jurisdictions, but the underlying capabilities transfer completely. Agricultural knowledge translates wherever crops grow. A farmer who understands soil management, irrigation, and animal husbandry carries expertise that has been valuable for 10,000 years and will remain valuable for 10,000 more. By contrast, skills that depend entirely on local context, knowledge of a specific legal system, relationships with a specific government, expertise in a specific regulatory environment, may become worthless upon displacement. The Russian aristocrat, whose only skill was managing serfs, found that skill useless in Paris. The Cuban bureaucrat, whose expertise was navigating Castro's system, found that expertise worthless in Miami. The skill must be separable from the system that created it. For those seeking to build collapse-resistant capabilities, the investment is straightforward, but requires years. Develop expertise that produces value independent of location, language, or political system. Invest continuously in skills that solve problems humans will always face: health, shelter, food, infrastructure, communication. These skills compound over time. Unlike gold, which sits inert, skills improve with use. Unlike land, which is fixed, skills travel freely. Unlike currency, which can be printed into worthlessness, skills become more valuable as the systems around them fail. But skills have one limitation: they require a functioning society in which to deploy them. A surgeon without a hospital, a farmer without seeds, an engineer without materials. All are constrained by the availability of essential inputs, which brings us to the fifth and final asset, the one that provides those inputs when supply chains shatter. On October 17, 1973, the lights began to go out across the Western world. That morning, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an embargo against nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa would receive no Arab oil until their policies changed. Within weeks, the price of crude quadrupled, from 3 per barrel to 12. Gas stations across America posted signs reading, "Sorry, no gas today." Drivers waited in lines that stretched for miles, engines idling, tempers rising. The federal government imposed a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. President Nixon asked citizens to turn down their thermostats. The most powerful nation on earth had been brought to its knees, not by military force, not by economic manipulation, but by the simple denial of a commodity it could not produce in sufficient quantities. This is the lesson that every empire eventually learns. Commodities are the foundation upon which everything else rests. Currency is a claim on commodities. Financial assets are derivatives of commodities. Economic power flows from the control of commodities. When the commodity supply fractures, the entire system built upon it trembles. The OPEC embargo was not the first demonstration of this principle. 17 years earlier, another commodity choke point had revealed the same vulnerability. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This single waterway carried 2/3 of Europe's oil supply. Britain and France, the former colonial powers whose companies had controlled the canal, faced an immediate crisis. Their economies depended on a shipping lane now controlled by a government hostile to their interests. The British and French response, a secret agreement with Israel to invade Egypt and retake the canal, ended in humiliation when the United States refused to support the operation. Britain was forced to withdraw. The message was unmistakable. A nation that cannot secure its commodity supply chains cannot project power, regardless of its military capabilities. This lesson has echoed through every subsequent decade. In 1984, Britain's coal miners went on strike in a dispute over pit closures. For 1 year, the country that had built its industrial revolution on coal confronted the vulnerability of depending on a single energy source. Power stations ran low on fuel. The government implemented emergency measures. The strike eventually failed, but it demonstrated how thoroughly a modern economy could be disrupted by the interruption of a single commodity. The pattern extends beyond energy. In the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, a strange economy emerged across Eastern Europe. The ruble had become nearly worthless. Bank accounts had been frozen or inflated away. The formal economy had largely ceased to function, but people still needed to eat, to travel, to heat their homes. Into this vacuum stepped an informal commodity currency. Cigarettes. Packs of Marlboros became a unit of exchange across the former Soviet bloc. The value was stable, far more stable than any government-issued currency. They were divisible into individual cigarettes for small transactions. They were portable, recognizable, and in constant demand. A doctor might accept 2 cartons for a consultation. A mechanic might charge 5 packs for a repair. This was not unique to the Soviet collapse. The same pattern had emerged in post-war Germany, in prisoner of war camps, in any environment where formal currency had failed but human needs persisted. Commodities with intrinsic utility became money when money itself had lost meaning. But here is where the pattern reveals its complexity. Not all commodity exposure is equal. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on earth, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than Iraq. By every measure of resource wealth, Venezuela should be one of the richest nations in the world. Instead, by 2019, the average Venezuelan had lost 24 pounds due to food shortages. Inflation exceeded 1,000,000%. Citizens fled by the millions. The nation with the most oil sat in darkness during blackouts that lasted days. This is the Venezuelan oil paradox. Possessing commodities is not the same as benefiting from commodities. Venezuela's oil required heavy investment to extract and refine. The state oil company, starved of capital and expertise after the government drove out foreign partners, saw production collapse from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 by 2020. The commodity existed beneath Venezuelan soil, but the capacity to transform that commodity into wealth had been destroyed. The Netherlands discovered a related danger decades earlier. The Groningen gas field, discovered in 1959, was one of the largest natural gas deposits ever found. The revenues transformed the Dutch economy, but not entirely for the better. As gas exports surged, the Dutch guilder strengthened. This made Dutch manufactured goods more expensive on world markets. Factories that had competed globally found themselves priced out. The manufacturing sector shrank. The economy became increasingly dependent on a single depleting resource. Economists named this phenomenon Dutch disease, the paradox where resource wealth undermines the broader economic base. When the resource depletes or prices fall, the nation discovers it has hollowed out the capabilities that once made it prosperous. Texas has lived this cycle repeatedly. Boomtowns that sprung up around oil discoveries became ghost towns when the wells ran dry. Fortunes made in a decade evaporated in a year. The commodity giveth, and the commodity taketh away. So what does this mean for individual wealth preservation? The lesson is not to speculate on commodity prices. That game is dominated by professionals with information and resources that individuals cannot match. The lesson is to understand commodities as the foundation of survival and to position accordingly. 4 categories of commodities matter when systems fail. Water and food represent immediate survival. When supply chains fracture, those who can produce or access food and clean water possess the ultimate leverage. This circles back to productive agricultural land, not as an investment, but as a source of essential commodities. Energy provides heat, transportation, and power. Those with access to fuel, whether stored gasoline, propane, wood, or solar generation capacity, maintain capabilities that others lose. Medicine and medical supplies become critical when healthcare systems are overwhelmed or inaccessible. Basic antibiotics, insulin, blood pressure medications. These simple commodities become priceless when pharmacies are empty. Trade goods historically emerge as informal currencies: alcohol, tobacco, batteries, ammunition, coffee. Items that people want, that store well, that divide easily into transaction-sized units. The wealthy have always understood this. Their estates include not just financial assets, but productive capacity. Farms, timber, livestock, wells, they are not merely rich in currency. They are rich in the things that currency is supposed to buy. But understanding these 5 assets is only half the equation. The other half is recognizing when they become necessary. What are the warning signs that indicate a collapse is approaching? And how many of them are flashing right now? There is a chart that circulates among institutional investors, a chart most retail investors will never see. It tracks the ratio of total US government debt to gross domestic product, plotted over 120 years. For most of that timeline, the ratio fluctuated between 30% and 60%. Wars caused temporary spikes. The Civil War, World War I, World War II, but each spike was followed by a return to the baseline. Then the line began to climb. In 1980, US debt to GDP stood at 31%. By 2000, it had reached 55%. By 2010, it was 91%. By 2020, it crossed 130%, a level previously reached only at the peak of World War II, when the nation was fighting a 2-front war against fascism. But here is what makes the current trajectory different. After World War II, the ratio declined for 35 consecutive years, as the economy grew faster than the debt. Today, the ratio is still climbing. Every projection from the Congressional Budget Office shows it continuing to climb. There is no plan to reverse it. There is no serious proposal to reverse it. The political system has lost the capacity to even discuss reversing it. This is not pessimism. This is arithmetic. The numbers have reached a scale that defies human intuition. The US national debt now exceeds $34 trillion. If you spent $1 every second, it would take you 688 years to spend $1 trillion. The United States adds that amount in new debt roughly every 100 days. Interest payments on this debt have become the fastest growing category of federal spending. In fiscal year 2024, the US government spent over $870 billion just on interest, more than the entire defense budget. This money produces nothing. It builds no bridges, funds no research, educates no children. It simply services the debt accumulated by previous spending. And interest rates, after a decade of near zero levels, have risen. Each percentage point increase in average interest rates adds approximately $300 billion in annual interest expense. The debt itself is growing, and the cost of servicing that debt is growing faster. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of the banking system, a vulnerability has emerged that few Americans understand. When interest rates rose in 2022 and 2023, banks that had loaded up on long-term treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities during the low-rate era found themselves holding assets worth far less than they had paid for them. These losses were unrealized. The banks had not sold the assets, so they did not have to report the losses as real. But the losses were real. By mid-2024, the Federal Reserve estimated that unrealized losses in the US banking system exceeded $620 billion. This is not a hypothetical risk. It is a hole that exists today, hidden by accounting conventions that allow banks to pretend the losses have not occurred. 3 regional banks, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic, discovered in 2023 what happens when depositors lose confidence and those unrealized losses suddenly become very real. All 3 failed within weeks of each other, representing the second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in American history. The response was instructive. The Federal Reserve, Treasury, and FDIC announced that all depositors would be made whole, even those with deposits far exceeding the $250,000 insurance limit. The message was clear. The system cannot withstand significant bank failures. It will be backstopped at any cost. But backstopping has a cost. That cost is paid in the purchasing power of the currency. This dynamic is not lost on foreign observers. For 80 years, the US dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency. The asset that central banks hold, that commodities are priced in, that international trade settles through. This status has granted America what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in a currency it can print, to run deficits that would destroy any other nation. But the privilege depends on trust, and trust, once lost, does not return quickly. In 2023, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, held a summit where de-dollarization was a central topic. The details remained vague, but the intent was clear. The nations representing 40% of the world's population and 25% of its GDP were actively discussing alternatives to dollar dependence. China has been reducing its holdings of US Treasury securities for over a decade. Russia, after Western sanctions froze its dollar reserves in 2022, has accelerated its shift toward gold and Chinese yuan. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system since 1974, has publicly discussed accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales. These shifts are gradual. The dollar will not be replaced next year or the year after, but the direction is unmistakable. The foundations of dollar dominance are eroding, slowly but continuously. And then there is the behavior of central banks themselves. The institutions that understand monetary systems better than anyone. In 2022 and 2023, central banks around the world purchased gold at the fastest pace since 1967. China added over 200 tons to its official reserves. Poland, Singapore, Turkey, and India all increased their holdings significantly. The institutions responsible for managing currency systems were quietly diversifying out of paper and into metal. When central bankers, the high priests of fiat currency, begin accumulating gold, it suggests a level of concern that their public statements do not acknowledge. The wealthy have noticed. Applications for citizenship by investment programs, second passports purchased through investment in foreign countries, have reached record levels. The individuals and families with the most to lose are quietly acquiring exit options. They are buying property in Portugal, citizenship in Malta, residency in Singapore. They are not predicting collapse. They are preparing for contingencies. Agricultural land purchases by institutional investors have accelerated. Bill Gates has become the largest private farmland owner in America, with holdings exceeding 270,000 acres. Foreign sovereign wealth funds have increased their US farmland acquisitions. Those with long-time horizons and deep resources are converting financial assets into productive land. None of this guarantees that collapse is imminent. The US economy remains the largest and most dynamic in the world. The dollar remains indispensable to global trade. The American military guarantees a level of stability that no other power can provide. But the warning signs that preceded every previous collapse are present. The debt levels, the currency debasement, the foreign loss of confidence, the behavior of insiders. The question is not whether these patterns exist, they do. The question is what you will do about them. Which brings us to the final calculation, the one that separates those who preserve wealth across generational disruption from those who become casualties of it. On the morning of March 16, 2013, the citizens of Cyprus woke to discover that the rules had changed while they slept. Overnight, the Cypriot government, under pressure from the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, had announced a stability levy on all bank deposits. Savings accounts below $100,000 would be taxed at 6.75%. Accounts above that threshold would lose 9.9%. The money would be taken directly. There would be no withdrawal, no appeal, no recourse. Banks remained closed for nearly 2 weeks while the details were finalized. ATMs were emptied within hours. Citizens stood in lines desperately trying to access money that was no longer entirely theirs. When the banks finally reopened, accounts above $100,000 at the largest bank had lost 47.5% of their value. Not through inflation, not through investment losses, through direct government confiscation. The term for this was bail-in. The concept was simple. Rather than taxpayers bailing out failed banks, the depositors would bear the losses. Your savings were no longer your savings. They were a loan to the bank. A loan that could be seized when the bank's survival required it. Cyprus was not an anomaly. It was a template. European regulators subsequently enshrined bail-in provisions into law across the Eurozone. The Bank of England adopted similar frameworks. The principle was established: in the next crisis, depositors would pay. This was the lesson of Cyprus. The money you believe is safe in a bank is only as safe as the institution holding it and the government overseeing that institution. When those institutions face existential pressure, your deposits become their solution. 5 years earlier, Iceland had demonstrated what happens when an entire banking system fails. In October 2008, Iceland's 3 largest banks collapsed within a single week. Their combined assets were 10 times the country's GDP. The government could not bail them out. The numbers were simply too large. The Icelandic krona lost half its value. Inflation spiked. Capital controls were imposed that would last for 8 years. Icelanders, who had kept their savings in domestic banks, in domestic currency, watched their purchasing power evaporate. Those who had diversified internationally, who had maintained accounts in foreign currencies in foreign jurisdictions, preserved what their neighbors lost. Iceland eventually recovered, the economy stabilized, the capital controls were lifted. But the recovery took nearly a decade, and those who had not prepared spent that decade rebuilding from nothing. The same year, on the other side of the Atlantic, a different kind of failure unfolded. Northern Rock, a British mortgage lender, experienced the first bank run in the United Kingdom in over 150 years. Depositors queued around the block, desperate to withdraw their savings before the institution collapsed. The images: British citizens lined up outside a failing bank, shocked a nation that believes such scenes belong to history. The government eventually nationalized Northern Rock, protecting depositors. But the photographs remained. A reminder that bank runs are not relics of the 1930s. They can happen in developed nations, in the 21st century, to people who never imagined they would need to worry about the safety of their bank. 3 years later, in 2011, customers of MF Global learned an even harsher lesson. MF Global was a commodities brokerage, a firm that held customer funds in supposedly segregated accounts, legally separate from the firm's own money. When MF Global collapsed due to bad bets on European sovereign debt, customers discovered that their segregated funds had been used to cover the firm's losses. Over $1.6 billion in customer money had simply vanished. The customers had done nothing wrong. They had followed the rules. They had chosen a regulated firm. They had believed the legal protections would protect them. They were wrong. It took years of litigation to recover a portion of the missing funds. Some customers never recovered fully. The rules, it turned out, were only as strong as the institutions enforcing them. Greece, between 2010 and 2015, provided a prolonged demonstration of what happens when a developed nation's finances spiral beyond control. Capital controls were imposed in June 2015. Greeks were limited to withdrawing $60 per day from ATMs. Bank transfers abroad were prohibited. A nation of 11 million people discovered that their money was trapped, accessible only in small amounts, only within the country, only at the government's discretion. The controls lasted for years. Greeks who had needed to make large purchases, who had business obligations abroad, who had planned to travel, found their lives constrained by the daily withdrawal limit. Their money existed in theory. In practice, it was inaccessible. Those who had moved funds abroad before the controls were imposed faced no such constraints. Their euros in German banks, their dollars in American accounts remained fully accessible. The border that trapped their neighbors' money did not trap theirs. These 5 examples, Cyprus, Iceland, Northern Rock, MF Global, Greece, share a common thread. In each case, people who believed they were safe discovered they were not. The protections they trusted, a deposit insurance, segregated accounts, stable currencies, reliable banks, failed when they were needed most. This is not an argument for paranoia. Paranoia leads to poor decisions, selling everything, hoarding cash, retreating from society. That approach destroys wealth as surely as any collapse. This is an argument for pattern recognition. The patterns are clear. They have repeated across centuries. They will repeat again. The only question is whether you will be positioned among those who preserve wealth through the disruption, or among those who lose it. The 5 assets discussed in this documentary, physical gold, productive land, stable foreign currency, transferable skills, and essential commodities, are not speculative bets. They are not predictions of imminent doom. They are recognition of what has survived when other things have not. For those seeking to apply these patterns, a framework emerges from the historical record. Physical gold representing 10% to 20% of net worth, held in physical form, diversified across jurisdictions. Not paper gold, not ETFs, not futures contracts. Metal you can touch, stored where governments cannot easily reach. This is not an investment in the traditional sense. It is insurance. Insurance that has paid out in every major monetary crisis for 5,000 years. Productive land, acquired for the long term, capable of generating income through agriculture, timber, livestock, or other tangible production. Land in jurisdictions with long histories of property rights protection. Land with water access. Land you can reach, manage, and defend if necessary. Not speculative real estate. Productive capacity. Stable foreign currency. Held outside the domestic banking system, in jurisdictions with strong rule of law and conservative monetary policy. Swiss francs in Zurich. Singapore dollars in Singapore. Physical US dollars for immediate accessibility. Not all savings, but enough to provide options when domestic accounts become inaccessible. Transferable skills, developed continuously, applicable across borders and political systems. Medical training, engineering expertise, agricultural knowledge, skilled trades. These investments pay dividends throughout life and become invaluable during disruption. Unlike financial assets, skills cannot be confiscated. They appreciate with use. Essential commodities, either through direct stockpiling or through ownership of productive capacity. Food security, energy access, basic medical supplies, items that retain value when financial systems fail and that provide leverage when supply chains fracture. The proportions shift based on individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and assessment of current conditions. A young professional with high earning potential might weight skills heavily and physical assets lightly. A retiree with accumulated savings might reverse that emphasis. A family with children might prioritize land and physical security above portfolio optimization. But the framework itself, diversification across asset types that have historically survived collapse, applies universally. There is a difference between this approach and doomsday prepping. The prepper builds a bunker and waits for the end. The pattern recognition investor builds resilience and continues living. The bunker mentality is paralyzing. The resilience mentality is empowering. The goal is not to predict collapse. Prediction is impossible. The goal is to be positioned so that collapse, if it comes, does not destroy you. So that your children and grandchildren inherit not worthless paper, but durable wealth. This is what the old families understood. The families that maintained wealth across centuries while empires rose and fell around them. They did not time markets. They did not predict wars. They held assets that survived regardless of what happened. They thought in generations, not quarters. And here is the final calculation, the one that separates the prepared from the unprepared. Everything we have discussed in this documentary requires action taken before crisis arrives. Gold purchased during a currency collapse costs multiples of what it costs today. Land acquired during social upheaval comes with risks that peacetime purchases do not. Foreign accounts opened during capital controls are impossible to open at all. The window for preparation exists only while the system still functions. When the system fails, the window closes. On December 25, 1991, the night before the Soviet flag came down for the last time, it was already too late for Soviet citizens to prepare. The decisions that would determine who preserved wealth and who lost everything had been made years earlier, quietly, by those who recognized the patterns. The American flag still flies. The dollar still circulates. The banks still open each morning. The system still functions. But the patterns that preceded every previous collapse are present. The debt, the debasement, the loss of foreign confidence, the behavior of insiders quietly diversifying, the central banks accumulating gold. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes with haunting consistency. The Soviet citizens who prepared survived. The German families who diversified in 1921 emerged from 1923 intact. The Argentines who held dollars weathered 2001. The Cypriots who banked abroad kept what their neighbors lost. Those who ignored the patterns, who trusted that this time was different, that their country was exceptional, that the rules would hold, became statistics. The choice is yours. It always has been. But the window will not stay open forever.